loop right now. Let's concentrate on these three statements. So these three statements are essentially the same thing. This last one is a compact way of writing the same thing. So initially our I variable contains a value of 0. So our compiler is going to retrieve that value and it's going to replace this I, this variable name, with the value of 0 in here. So right now, when it has a value of 0, it adds 0 plus 1. So at this moment, it's going to replace it's going to use that result and replace the previous value with the value that it now has calculated. So right now it has the value of 1 after the calculation, because we know that 0 plus 1 is 1. So essentially, let me just revert back to my previous statement. So essentially, this statement is also the same thing as this one, and this statement is also the same thing as this one. So when the compiler, let's now focus on the for loop. When the compiler reaches this curly brace, the ending curly brace, or when it reaches the end of the for loop's body, it's going to initiate this, or it's going to start processing this last statement of the for loop. So this I is actually the I that we have already declared in the first statement. Now it's going to add 1 to the previous value of I. So the previous value, we know that initially we had 0 because we are running this loop for the first time. So for the first time, the loop has got the variable with a value of 0, and when the program reaches the end of the body, it's going to increment or add 1 to the value, 1 to the previous value, which is 0, 1, which is 0, and it's going to add 1 to that value. Now the I contains the value of 1. So when the loop runs for the second time, this part will not be 0. This part will be 1. So right now, if the loop is running for the second time, this 0 will be replaced with 1 because we have already added 1 at the last iteration. So right now, the value of I, the variable of I contains the value of 1. And then if we revert back to our original statement, which is I less than count pages, let's save this. So this was the original statement, and this was the original part in our echo statement. Right now, in the second iteration, so in the first iteration, our I contained the value of 0. So in the first iteration, our compiler has completed its execution. Then when it has completed its execution, it added the value of 1 to the previous value of I. So the value of I right now contains 0. Now our loop is going to run again. Why? Because our loop looks into this condition. First, it assigns the value of 1 to this variable, and then it looks into this condition. When the condition actually renders out to be true, or when the value of I is less than the total number of elements in the pages array, when this is true, then it's going to enter the body and it's going to execute the body. So right now, the value of I is 1, and then this variable is now going to it is now going to have the value of 1, and because 1 is less than the number of elements, or 1 is less than 6, that's why our compiler is going to run this code again. But this I inside this this index inside this pages array is now going to be 1. So when it is 1, it moves on to the next element, and then it prints out the next element, which is next element's value, which is sharp in here. So likewise, it goes on until it reaches the last element. So because we are now in the second iteration, when the compiler reaches the end of the second iteration, or when it reaches the end of the body, it's going to start processing this last statement, and likewise it's going to add 1 to the previous value. So at this moment, the previous value of I is 1, and then our program is going to add 1. Our program is going to increment this 1 by 1, which means it's going to add 1 to this one that we have in the second iteration. So this is now going to turn into 2. So right now we have completed second iteration, or we have completed the second part. And then when the loop reverts back to its original position, or when it runs for the third time, or when it is running for the third time for this part, then it's going to have a value of 2, because in the previous part we have already added 1 to we have already incremented the value of I. So right now our I contains 2, so 2 is less than the number of elements inside this pages array. So because 2 is less than 6, and we know that our array contains 6 elements, so our condition is true. So when the condition is true, our compiler is going to run the code inside this inside this clause. So right now our the index is going to be 2 for the array. So when the index is 2, it's actually going to print out this third element on the page. Likewise, this actually continues until it reaches the end. So how does the program understand that it has reached the end? So at the last iteration, it's going to have a value of 6 for the variable of I. So when the value of, so this in the we had something like this. So this I is similar to this I. This is actually so we now have the value of 6 for this I, and our compiler is going to replace this I with the value of 6. Now it's going to look into the right hand side, or the right hand operand. So the right hand operand is a function that's counting the number of elements. So the number of elements is we have got 6 elements inside this pages array. So this is going to replace that with 6. So when the compiler reads that 6 is less than 6, it actually doesn't make sense, which is, it's going, in our context, it doesn't make sense, because 6 cannot be less than 6, because 6 is actually equals to 6. So in programming's perspective, this is false. This is not true. So when the condition is false, the compiler is going to ignore this body right now. It has already done its job. That's when the compiler is going to ignore this body, and our loop iteration has completed its entire process. So after this, our program or our compiler is not going to go back to this position of for loop. And that's when we have the last element, contact us, printed out on the web page. I know it's a little difficult at the beginning of understanding the concept, but when you write more code, or when you practice more, it's going to get easier. So we are also going to look into how the while loop works with the same example. because while loop can actually replicate what the for loop does, but it's going to take a little more coding, or we're going to need a few more lines of code to do the same thing on our page.